Hey, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the third installment of our incredible series with our partners at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, where we dive into extremism, the mechanisms that drive it, and the tools we can use to combat it. So, in this third edition, we're going to be talking about the UK's prevent strategy and how they've really combated the radical right and extremism generally. And for that, we have the wonderful Sean Arbuthnot here, a prevent coordinator in the UK, and fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right. And so, how are you doing?
Really well, thanks. It's good to see you finally. We've chatted so much on email. It's nice to actually see you face to face.
Yeah, it's one of those things where when you go back and forth and edit articles and work on pieces together, it's almost like you already know the person. But
Yeah,
it's definitely great to finally see you here.
likewise.
So we'll just dive in. You're a prevent coordinator at the UK, as we said, and for those of our viewers who might not know or be familiar, prevent is the UK's flagship counter-terrorism and counter-extremism agenda. So let's just start by getting some more information about what prevent is about, what it really entails, and your role in that process in combating extremism.
Sure, no problem. Well, in a nutshell, I guess prevent is very similar to what other parts of the world would call PVE or CVE, preventing or countering violent extremism. And it's a UK government strategy, which is all about trying to identify people who are vulnerable to extremism or radicalization. And then with their consent, we would put in place wraparound care and support and positive interventions to try and move them to a place of safety before they have the opportunity to commit acts of violence. And another major component of prevent is about building resilience to radicalization. And we do that through a lot of community engagement and projects and social programs and things like that. It's fair to say that prevent is just one strand of the UK's wider counter-terrorism strategy, which is known as contest. And that's basically divided into four key areas, which are known as the 4Ps for obvious reasons, because they are protect, pursue, prevent, and prepare. And each one kind of plays its own role in trying to tackle a range of issues around terrorism and keep the country safe. The main element obviously would be pursue, the policing side of things.
Yeah.
This is where most of the budget goes. That's all about trying to achieve terrorist prosecutions. But then equally important, we've got protect, which is about our physical infrastructure and security. So putting in place measures to try and stop a terror attack from happening in the first instance. Prepare is about how we respond to terror attacks, because sadly, they're a fact of life. In many ways, they're inevitable. We're not going to be able to stop each and every one of them. So it's about making sure our emergency services are well trained and able to respond to a terrorist attack. And then finally, we've got the prevent strand, which is the area that I work in. And as you'd expect, it's all about trying to prevent people from going down that path in the first instance.
That's definitely a lot more robust of a system than we have here in the U.S., of course. And I'm sure your 12 years as a police detective really informed some of these skills that you've had to utilize when addressing this. So I mean, how do you go about? Because I know one of the things that you need to do is to spot vulnerabilities and the warning signs of extremism. So how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've reflected on that quite a lot, actually, in terms of how my policing background has prepared me for this current role. As a prevent coordinator, I'm responsible at a local level for pulling together all of the different agencies that are responsible for delivering prevent, because one of the key things about it is it's not a law enforcement tool. We rely on working in partnership with colleagues from, social services and local government and health and education and things like that. And I've always been interested in this line of work, going right back to, I did an internship at the Carter Center in Atlanta, Georgia back in 2001 on their conflict resolution program. And that's what kind of set me on this path.
Oh, wow.
Then did a master's degree and then my police career. And I think one of the key things I think that policing has helped me with is in treating people with respect and empathy. So in policing, you see the very worst in society, you see the very best. And in order to achieve successful prosecutions, you may find yourself in a situation where you have to maybe interview someone who's been accused of a really heinous crime, and you're not really going to get anywhere if you don't build up a rapport with them during the interview process, you know? So just little things like, however difficult it may be, however challenging it may be, treating people with a bit of dignity and respect and empathy, I think goes a long way. And I think that's one of the key things that we try to do in Prevent, because at the end of the day, as you said, it's about trying to spot people who are vulnerable, and recognizing that we're dealing with people who may have various challenges, etc., in their lives. We're trying to intervene early, so it's not like they are full-fledged criminals at this stage. They're not extremists or radicalized. We're trying to intervene early to try and stop them from going down that path. So I guess when it comes to spotting the vulnerabilities and the warning signs, there's no specific checklist. You know, there's no ticky box that I can give you that will determine what makes one person more likely to be an extremist over someone else. There is no single profile, no single pathway to extremism. Every case that I've ever dealt with has been unique and individual. But I go back to the point about how it's not specifically a law enforcement issue. You know, my police career may well have prepared me for working in this area, but we couldn't do it alone. And we couldn't do it without the partnership of other agencies as well, who come into contact with vulnerable people and are well placed to spot the vulnerabilities and the warning signs as well, you know?
Yeah, because, you know, you're right, because it's really, when it comes to the vulnerabilities, what we're talking about here is, especially during the COVID, we've seen, or the pandemic, we've seen this issue where people are kind of gravitating towards just community itself. They're, you know, one of the biggest vulnerabilities has been just isolation and loneliness over the past year, right? And there's been one of my friends became a QAnon conspiracy theorist, not recently, but in the past. And, you know, you're right when it comes to, it's not always, like you said, they don't start out as some hardened, you know, extremists or hardened criminals. And you got to have that empathy to be able to understand how they got there. And then that's how you can really understand how to prevent it in the first place. So one of the aspects, like your last article, your first, or not your first, but your most recent article for Rantt was about kind of like the localized community approach, targeted approach to preventing extremism. Because one of the things we have in the US is we don't have a prevent strategy, really. It's not as much about prevention, it's about spotting. What everyone's focused on now is kind of just spotting the existing extremist pockets and going on Telegram and trying to figure out when the next attack will be. But there's not really much of a prevent strategy. So how is the community localized approach put into practice in the UK in your work? And just tell us a little bit more about that, because that's definitely something the US doesn't have. And it'd be an interesting dichotomy to try to figure out how to do that without also infringing on like civil liberties in the US.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it speaks to the fact that Prevent is technically not a de-radicalization program, as it's sometimes referred to, because we're trying to work upstream and work with individuals who are vulnerable to radicalization in the first instance. I always think we often use a quote in the Prevent Network in the UK from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who said something to the effect of, you know, there comes a point where we need to stop pulling people out of the river. We need to go further upstream and find out why they've fallen in the first place, you know? And that's what we try to do in Prevent. So our approach is very much a pro-social public health approach. And although it's part of the counter-terrorism landscape, what you find in practice is that Prevent is very much a safeguarding duty. And so what we try and do is we try to employ the same sorts of techniques and interventions that are used across the wider safeguarding spectrum. And it may sound a bit more dramatic because it's associated with terrorism.
Yeah.
We're dealing with human beings at the end of the day. And you said yourself, you know, no one's born a terrorist. No child is born to hate. And it's very easy, I think, for the wider public and for media outlets, for instance, to just dismiss people as monsters or psychopaths or dramatically different from the rest of us, you know. But
Yeah.
really and truly, they're not. We're dealing with human beings at the end of the day who go through the same challenges and struggles in life that we do. So I think one of the key things that I'd like to get across is that when we talk about the sorts of vulnerabilities that people face, you know, potential extremists that that terrorist groups can kind of capitalize on, they're no different to the sorts of vulnerabilities that we all go through in day-to-day life, you know, feelings of isolation, low self-esteem, potentially mental health issues, lack of critical thinking skills, bereavement, trauma, all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
But I think what sets people who are vulnerable to terrorism apart is that they may not necessarily have any protective factors in place around them, you know? So I personally, I would have a desire to feel important, would succumb to peer pressure, may have mental health issues, but I would have family, friends, and colleagues around me who can support me during those dark times, you know, because, you know, let's face it, life's not easy at the best of times, particularly the year that we've all just had. And I think what extremist groups are very adept at doing is spotting those individuals who don't have those protective factors. No one gets involved in extremism when their life is going well. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Kind
You're not, you know, making millions of dollars or have a great family. You're like, you know what? I think it's a good idea for me to go join that terrorism cell. You know, that's not how
Yeah,
it works.
exactly. And that's quite that, you know, that might be a simplistic way of looking at it, but that's, I think, human nature at the end of the day, you know. No one gets embroiled in these sorts of things if they're not looking for something, if they're not missing something in our lives. So when it comes to the kind of community engagement that we put in place at that really early level, it's important that what we, and this also speaks to whenever we're dealing with vulnerable individuals on a one-to-one basis as well, you know, the higher risk individuals, it's about responding to whatever grievances or vulnerabilities that they may have and giving them solutions, giving them an outlet for it, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a number of ways in which we would do that. So I guess the bread and butter of prevent work comes in a program called Channel. And that's where we work with individuals who are referred to us because they may well be presenting as risky when it comes to radicalization and extremism. It's a voluntary program, and it basically involves putting in place care and support, which can take the form of help with education, help finding employment or housing, anger management, all of those sorts of things. But one of the keys is the mentoring that we put in place. And the mentoring is bespoke. It's really tailored to a specific individual's issues or grievances, whatever they may be. That's been really, really powerful. And I guess just, I'm trying to think of a practical example in a way in which I can demonstrate how this can work on the ground.
Are there former extremists involved in this too, like that come and advise on how to, you know, that mentor these people and come who are coming out of, because sometimes it's young people too, you know, and misguided folks. So are there people who have been in that space that come out and then come to help to advise?
Absolutely, yeah. We I think the role that formers can play, former extremists, is really powerful, from different backgrounds, different types of extremism. So our mentors, for instance, would come from a pool of intervention providers, we would call them, individuals who have been vetted and approved by the Home Office in the UK, and they're able to work on a confidential one-to-one basis with vulnerable people who get referred to prevent. And they can come from a range of backgrounds. You know, some of them could be religious scholars, for instance. Others maybe specialize in working with gangs or may specialize in certain mental health issues. But some of our most impactful intervention providers are former extremists themselves.
Yeah.
And they can provide a really powerful sort of counter narrative when they've been there, done that, and they know the reality of joining an extremist group, and they know the grooming techniques and the lies that recruiters tell and those sorts of things. And they carry a lot more weight and credibility than someone perhaps who works in law enforcement would, You know, if you want to work with someone and they maybe mistrust authority, well, if you can pair them up with someone who has walked a similar path in their life, then it can be really powerful indeed, you know. So yeah.
It's like how AA, you know, is so powerful for, you know, alcoholics when they you know, I actually quit drinking myself about
Wow.
7 years ago. I never really got into AA, but I you know, from what I did see, it's like one of those things where, you know, you can't. I remember when I was coming out, it's not the same thing, obviously. I'm not comparing extremism to alcoholism, but it's like there's one of those things where you have, if someone who's not drinking, just from a practical sense, like someone who's not drinking telling you, or someone who's already never drank before saying you shouldn't drink, you're like, psh. But if someone had been there, made the same mistakes you have, and advises you, say, you know what, maybe I should listen to this person, they're better now, and they have a better life. You get to see. I think there's something to, with the extremism aspect, to seeing the light on the other side, because there's so much like trying to prevent this by talking about the negatives, like, oh, this will, you know, this will get you here, this will get you in trouble. But if you see a former extremist come and mentor you and say, look at me now, right? Like, I was hurt, I was doing this, but now I have a job, I have a family, you know, I was an incel and I, you know, was a misogynist. And that's a lot, because that's a lot of what drives people to extremism in the first place. Listen, now I have a family and a wife and I got a great job, and it's because I came out of this. Here's the path I could walk. I think positive reinforcement is a way, because and just on the practical sense of this, when you see, given what you've done in the UK, how do you think the US would be able to do that specifically? So, like, would they be collaborating with like NGOs and kind of having a system there? And like you said, it's voluntary. So extremists come to you, or they're or how are they identified?
Yeah, I mean, just going back to your point actually about, you know, role models and the like,
Yeah.
I just want to get something in here, and I hope this chap won't mind me mentioning him. We did some work with basically a former neo-Nazi, a man who had I mean, traumatic doesn't even begin to describe his upbringing. You know, it seemed like the poor man never really had a chance, and he found himself seeking solace in alcohol and drugs and on the football terraces, or the soccer terraces for people in the States,
Yeah.
where he got involved in hooliganism, which led him to joining an extreme right-wing party called the British Nationalist Party, or sorry, British National Party. He had a falling out with their leaders because, in his words, they weren't proactive enough, i.e. they weren't sort of violent enough. So he set up his own sort of paramilitary organization, had a mental breakdown. He ended up being one of the first people to go through the Channel program in the UK. And if you fast forward to a few years later, he is now a pastor at his local church. Wow. He runs a soup kitchen to help the homeless, I think on a Thursday night. He's engaged to be married. I'm going to his wedding later on in the summer.
Wow, that's crazy.
Talk about a path of redemption, you know. He's one of the most inspirational people I've ever met, and he can talk to thousands upon thousands of school children in the UK and tell his personal story. And to see the positive change that he has made in his life and the role model that he now presents to other people is absolutely fantastic. Yeah. So that's essentially what we're all about, really. It's about giving people second chances and believing that no one is beyond redemption at the end of the day. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
No, we could stick to this because we can get to the practical, you know, wonky stuff in a little bit, but we can, because this is good. Like the you know, the story, his story alone, the storytelling, I think, is a really big aspect of this, because I think a lot of the times, too many, like I see the way the media handles a lot of the interviews. I mentioned this in my, you know, talk with William a couple weeks ago, where William of CARR, for the viewers who don't know, and we were talking about how, you know, the 60 Minutes interview, they just sit down current extremists and they just espouse their views, right? But I think one of the most powerful things to do is, you know, this former neo-Nazi who's had a complete turnaround, who's now an incredible guy. That's a story that could touch someone who, those are the stories about former extremists that need to be told. I think that former extremists need to be lifted up and not current ones, and have stories like powerful, inspirational stories like this told. I'm not sure if he's written a book yet, but he should, because these are the kind of things that can, if you get if you're just a young, aggrieved, white kid in America, and you're just watching Tucker Carlson, tell you you're about to be replaced by Mexicans, and that's the first step. And then suddenly you come across this article before you come across something else. So you come across this book, and suddenly you realize, I don't really want to go down this path. I may not want to go down it. And I think storytelling is a big aspect there. And I'm sure, just how, so on that topic, when you've seen, people like him change, and others, like, how many examples of those have you seen? How many extremists have you seen lives turned around?
See, this is a really interesting point, and it's one of the reasons why I left the police to work and prevent full time, because I felt that I made more of a difference and saw more positive change in people's lives in prevent than in any other aspect of policing I worked in.
Yeah.
And I can say personally that I have seen many scores of individuals whose lives have changed for the better as a result of that early intervention from prevent.
Awesome.
The difficult thing is getting that out there in the public domain, and making people aware of it, because at the end of the day, we're dealing with confidential safeguarding issues, and we also have a duty of care to those individuals, and we need to protect their anonymity. So if they don't want us to shout their stories from the rooftops, then our hands are tied.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate thing is that sometimes leaves a space then for negative case studies to creep in. And many of them are wildly exaggerated, or in some cases blatantly untrue. So that's a bit of an ongoing frustration of mine, and a bit of a battle that we have in the UK, when I know in my heart of hearts that we have affected lots of positive change, but we just can't necessarily always tell people about it, But anecdotally, I mean, I know of numerous examples, and I'll just rattle a few off for you now. First prevent case I ever dealt with was back in 2013. It was a young man who had told his psychiatrist that he was having violent fantasies, and he was hatching a plot to make his own homemade explosives. And he wanted to plant those explosives in a town in the Midlands, quite a rural town in the Midlands in the UK, the sort of place where you wouldn't expect anything like this to happen. We're not talking London or Manchester, And the words that he used to the psychiatrist were, "I want to do a Breivik." This young man was absolutely inspired by Anders Breivik, who we all know killed, I think, 77 people in a single day in Norway in 2011.
Yeah.
And we worked with him for 18 months through Prevent. Believe it or not, and again, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, just over a year ago, he got back in touch with me and we reconnected again. And he told me that Prevent kept him out of prison, about how angry he was back in those days, how all it would take would be for someone to look at him the wrong way and he'd want to fight them. But Prevent were the first people to actually sit down with him, and as challenging as it was, to listen to him, to challenge him, but in a sensitive way, rather than dismissing him.
Yeah.
Nazi as a monster. In fact, one of the things he said to me was, people used to call me a Nazi, but I wasn't a Nazi. But my thought process at the time was, well, if you're going to call me a Nazi, well, I'll show you how much of a Nazi I can be.
Yeah. It's one of those things where, it's like I know that people are having a difficult, because, of course, at the same time, you have to call out things for what they are. But then it's like walking that line while also not, generalizing entire groups, right? So I think this is a good time to actually bring up the fact that, I know Prevent, there's been some criticism of Prevent, given with the way, especially when it was focused on Islamic terrorism and extremism. And it's one of those things where I feel like we're learning lessons from the post 9/11 era now, as applying to this extremism problem, given how it's like kind of more widespread. But it feels almost a little bit like the opioid, feels almost a little like the opioid crisis in America, because I've heard criticism from people where they say, because I've personally tried to push like, hey, let's try our best to be empathetic and try to pull these people out, right? And let's not, let's not hit them hard. And then some of the criticism I've heard is, well, we're only saying that now because these are white Americans, right? Like it's almost like and because the reason why some would say that is because the war on drugs, when there was crack epidemic, they just locked up a bunch of black people, and then when the opioid crisis hit white families, suddenly it's now public health crisis, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah,
what I veer on is I don't really a mistake is a mistake regardless, right? And I think when you make the mistake that we made against Islamic extremism and the profiling, I don't think I'm trying my best now. In our rant and our reporting, as you know, I didn't really mince words during the Trump era much. Rant didn't. We went hard against that, but I really think now is a good time for, like you said, you know, he was called a Nazi, personally, and then it made him want to be more of one almost. And I think this is a good time to still call broader ideologies what they are, but give each individual the benefit of the doubt almost. If they're a Republican, let's not assume that they are what they are, right?
yeah,
And let's not just make assumptions that I know plenty of Republicans who don't even support Trump that, you know, or X and Y and aren't extremists. So it's one of these things where it's a really difficult line to walk. And I think uh, empathy, like you said, is really at the core here. And if we do something like this in the U.S., it'll be important to kind of have that. There was a skit where they made fun of, they were called like QAnonymous. It was like AA for, I know I mentioned AA earlier, but AA for QAnon people, and they were all telling their stories. But it's actually not a bad idea, right? And it's like one of those things where I think if we kind of create, because now it's becoming so rampant, I think there's the way to pull these people out is not to attack, but to kind of say, you know, hey, I get it. We've all been locked up for the past year. This sucks, you know, but let's not scapegoat. Let's pull you out, right?
yeah. I mean, there's so much in that. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for law enforcement. Do you know what I mean? Where
Yeah, of
someone's committed an act of violence or a
course.
crime, I'm all for prosecuting those individuals. But what we're talking about are those who haven't quite reached that stage yet.
Of
There's
course,
still
yeah.
a shot at redemption. There's still a chance to pull them back from the brink. And I think that's really important at the current time, because extremists from all sides, not just the radical right, they try and mainstream their messaging, don't they? They try and entice, you know, regular people, if you like, into their narratives by exploiting emotive national issues, conspiracy theories, you know, whether it's the COVID pandemic, both in the US and in the UK. I'm sure we've seen, you know, extremist groups trying to exploit that to their own ends, speaking to people's sometimes legitimate fears and questions about government policy or how effective vaccines are. And they kind of use that as a hook to lure people in and then get them into sort of more nefarious narratives, you know? And so I think it's really important that we recognize the fact that in many cases, it's vulnerable people that are being preyed upon. And I think you're absolutely right to bring up, you know, the very legitimate criticisms of potentially the early implementation of Prevent, when at that particular time, we're talking mid 2000s, aftermath of the 7/7 attacks in London in 2005. The perception was very much that threats to the UK were coming from international terrorism, Al-Qaeda inspired groups. And Prevent as a strategy was very much in its infancy at that time. It was quite police led at that time as well. Wasn't particularly open and transparent about, you know, its procedures and what it was doing. And so there was a justified perception that most of its focus was on our Muslim communities in the UK.
Mhm.
Never mind the fact that out of our, you know, peace-loving Muslim communities, it's only a very, very tiny minority that would ever consider turning to violence in pursuit of a political aim, you know. But we've evolved since then and we've matured since then. And
Okay.
I do think that, you know, if we don't learn from our mistakes of the past, then what is it? You're doomed to repeat them. Is that so? I'm more driven than ever to not label whole groups of individuals or communities as one collective monolith. You know, I think it's really important that we take a nuanced approach. especially since most of the referrals that we're seeing now in Prevent in the UK are not necessarily individuals who are affiliated to a particular group or really attached to a specific ideology. And I think this has been partly exacerbated by COVID and the rise of people spending more and more time online. What we're seeing are really personalized journeys of radicalization that feeds individual grievances and issues in someone's own life. They can take something from a website here and something from a forum here and something from a group chat there and come up with their own personalized radical ideology. And so we need to be alive to that risk, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point because, yeah, and the reason why I brought the criticism of Prevent is mostly just because I do think the program's evolved, and like you said, it's done incredible work, and I think it's one of those things where if when the U.S. thinks about it, they might try to jump to those earlier things, but I think there's a lot to learn from what Prevent has achieved. So, but on that point, and also when it comes to the self, you're right. People are really self-radicalizing, right? They're doing this journey where they, especially with QAnon now proliferating and really giving everybody, it's like just a buffet of conspiracy theories. They can pick and choose whatever because I believe the Q is Ron Watkins. I mean, I'm not sure if you've seen the Q Into the Storm documentary on HBO yet, but pretty almost very certain to me that it was the 8chan, owner Ron Watkins and his dad, and they really kind of just what they did with QAnon, if it is them, of course, was give really a funnel from which people can descend into really any extremist group that they want and kind of create their own ideology. So that's why it's more difficult, right? Because you can't. It's not like there's a set number of groups. It's not like before, like, okay, it's this person's a member of the KKK. They believe in X creed. This person's a neo-Nazi. They believe in X creed. It's like this person is, they believe that Hollywood elites are eating the life elixir of children, but they also believe that Mexicans are coming to replace them, and they also believe that Muslims are X, but they don't believe this. Like, it's like, it's very difficult to so in that environment, how is Prevent kind of like evolving to do this targeting when you have just a unbelievable assortment of varying ideologies, extremist views, and conspiracy theories culminating?
Yeah, that's a big question because, yeah, we're seeing a huge trend in people gravitating towards conspiracy theories for sure. And the likes of QAnon, I've heard it called a big tent conspiracy theory before. There's room for everybody underneath it in some way, shape, or form, And there's a legitimate debate to be had as to what extent they would meet the threshold for Prevent support.
Yeah.
In terms of, is there a counterterrorism risk, So for me, the distinction always has to be in cases where there is the threat of violence or the glorification of violence, the promotion of violence. I think that's the point at which Prevent would get involved. So we have had some referrals of individuals who have maybe attached themselves to a QAnon style ideology, but unless the threat of violence isn't there, then it's probably not one that would meet our threshold for the channel program for that really sort of bespoke support. But it really is disturbing the extent to which extremists and people who seek to do harm are really capitalizing on those sorts of fears that individuals have. I mean, we've mentioned the COVID pandemic, obviously, and I've seen cases locally here in the UK where right-wing groups have been putting leaflets through people's letterboxes, warning them not to listen to government advice around COVID, not to wear your face mask, not to get the vaccine. The hospital wards are empty. Now, I obviously disagree vehemently with all of that, but at the same time, I still think there's room for legitimate criticism and questioning of government policy when it comes to managing the pandemic. And a lot of, everyday people have legitimate questions and concerns about, what's contained in a vaccine that they're going to put into their bodies, and I get that. I really do. I mean, I'm a massive fan of science, but I get the fact that some people have concerns. For me, the disturbing thing was not only did this leaflet go through people's letterboxes, but the same group also posted leaflets around Great Replacement theory, claiming that white Britons are going to be a minority by the 2060s. Now, first of all, I'm not sure that's a bad thing. You know,
Yeah, of course.
welcome and embrace multiculturalism. But secondly, that again taps into people's fears. And if they see a COVID leaflet on one hand with pseudoscientific evidence around why they shouldn't take a vaccine, and then on the other hand, they're seeing this stuff about great replacement theories, you can very easily understand how, you know, individuals can get sucked into a rabbit hole. And the radical right are experts at this. And it's nothing new. They have always exploited these emotive national issues to feed their own agendas. In the UK, one of the classic examples is around child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs, and so-called Asian or Muslim grooming gangs that prey on young white girls. And this is a narrative that's been put out by the right wing time and time and time again, when in actual fact, the genuine risk and threat is a good deal more complex than that. That's not to say we shouldn't tackle sexual exploitation. Of course we should, but I don't want to be taking a steer from radical right groups who have their own agenda when it comes to raising these issues, to the point where in some cases they've actually perpetuated hoaxes about made up grooming gangs or made up missing persons in order to fuel this perception that it's only one community that's responsible for sexual offenses against children. It's absolute rubbish. That's how they suck people in, you know?
It's really been wild to see their tactics and how shameless and, you know, exploitive they can be, because what they do a lot of times, they'll take a kernel of truth and then just take someone down. Like for example, the COVID stuff, like they'll take a few examples of Johnson & Johnson blood clots and then say, look, the vaccine is here. They're trying to control you. They're trying to population control. Look, Bill Gates said X thing 20 years ago. They want to control you. And then we have Tucker now. You know, Tucker Carlson's really just been pushing on Fox News. He's now become the most extreme of everyone on the network, which is unbelievable given Hannity and Laura Ingraham exist. But they are now pushing this, like you said, the Great Replacement theory, which is a white supremacist ideology, hands down. It's in multiple manifestos. It was in the El Paso manifesto, and they were virtually quoting Donald Trump's rhetoric about Hispanics in that. There was a Christchurch shooting. There was all these various, and for him to shamelessly echo that is bringing it really into the mainstream here in a way that's really horrifying. And like you said, they kind of they'll take these little bits, and they're really good at exploiting existing mistrust and then taking it to the extreme. Like, yes, we should obviously be, for example, when it comes to wars, right? Like the Iraq war was obviously based on a giant lie, and that really shattered the trust of an entire generation. And that's why some young people get into QAnon, right? So they say, oh, you know, if they were willing to lie to you about this, why aren't they lying to you about this other thing? And that's just how they just keep roping people in. And it's one of those things where, you know, I really want to now, since I brought up Tucker Carlson and you also mentioned the mainstreaming of this, like I know in Prevent's work is specifically on counter-terrorism front. You're looking for acts of violence or someone who has the propensity to commit those acts and how to prevent those as they're going down that rabbit hole. But I mean, is that made more complicated when we have, especially in the US here, I know there's various self-proclaimed populists, even though that they're not really true populists, they're just nationalists, professing these views and mainstreaming them. And especially in the US, we have the entire Republican Party uniting around the lie the election was stolen, and they're now trying to undermine democracy in every state. When you have these extremist views being brought up to the highest, you know, power, influence circles in America and in the highest echelons of political power, and I feel like it's creating, well, I don't feel like, it's kind of obvious, it's creating more extremism. And it's just what do you see moving forward? Like the challenges with prevent, like I feel like your hands are going to be full. It's one of those things where it's like, to prevent, we have to kind of, it's almost at this point a part of this counter extremism effort is to kind of beat people at the ballot box, right? Almost like it's extending into a political party. So what are your thoughts on that, on how it's just kind of becoming so mainstream?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, and thankfully I don't think we've seen it yet to the same extent in the UK as other parts of Europe, and obviously the US have in recent years, albeit, you know, our government certainly gets an awful lot of criticism. I think the key thing that we try to do with people who get referred to prevent is try and foster and encourage a degree of critical thinking. And so it's all about people, you know, doing their own responsible research from credible sources and reaching their own conclusions and becoming proactive, socially responsible members of society at the end of the day. Very difficult when the mainstream political narratives seem to, you know, almost reward extremist behavior, as in the cases of the States, sadly, over the last few years. But I do think that can work. I mean, I think back to a case I once dealt with of a young man who was really firm in his belief and really open about the fact that he thought that a race war was coming. And when I first met him at his school, I was with a colleague, and this young lad shook my hand but wouldn't shake my colleague's hand. My colleague was mixed race, and he basically told us there and then that white people were a master race, that they're 100% pure, and that he didn't want to do anything stupid or do anything that would involve him ending up in prison, which I thought, okay, fine. Because he said he didn't want to end up in prison and be locked up inside when the race war was going on outside. And I thought, well, okay, then that's very problematic. I mean, if you knew this young lad's backstory, it's almost like the poor chap never stood a chance in terms of how he was raised, etc. You know, so we really saw him as a victim in many ways. You know, I think if I had been raised in the environment that he was, there's a very high likelihood that I would have ended up a white supremacist by the age of 15. You know. In any case, he went on the channel program. He was offered all different forms of support. It turned out there were underlying mental health issues that hadn't been diagnosed before. But one of the key things his intervention provider, his mentor, you know, encouraged him to do was to think critically about things. Now, going back to our early point about mentors, this intervention provider did have a background in right-wing extremism, you know, so they connected very, very quickly. They had very similar upbringings, even very similar taste in fashion, you know. And just by encouraging the young man to research things like DNA, which will go on to prove that nobody is 100% anything. You know, you go back far enough, we're all related to someone somewhere else in the world.
Hitler, for example.
Well, listen, I mentioned to you, didn't I, via email, that I think there's a remote chance that I'm related to President Biden on my mother's side. If you go back far enough, I hope to goodness that's true. But this smashed the notion that this young lad had that white people were 100% master race.
Yeah.
And so that provided the first sort of chink in the armor, if you like. And then to kind of explore those issues further, this young lad, big into his conspiracy theories, like a lot of radical right extremists, he was anti-Semitic and believed that the Holocaust never happened. So his mentor took him to the Holocaust Memorial Centre in the UK, where not only did he go on a museum tour and see for himself primary evidence of the horror and scale of the Holocaust, but he was also introduced over lunch to a Holocaust survivor.
Wow.
A man who'd been, you know, in a concentration camp, but at 3 years of age, he was the only surviving member of his family. Try telling him the Holocaust didn't happen, a living witness to it. So introducing critical thinking and those very real personal human interactions, because it's very easy to be hateful behind a computer screen.
Yeah.
You hate someone without actually knowing them. When you meet them face to face, then that's very, very powerful. So when it comes to challenging even sometimes those mainstreaming of extremist narratives, I would say encouraging people to think critically and encouraging human positive interaction with a range of people from different backgrounds, cultures, faiths, ethnicities, whatever it may be. I think those two things would go a long way actually in helping us get rid of those conditions which allow extremism to flourish. Because at the end of the day, all extremists thrive on division, don't they? They want to see the world in black and white terms and set people off against each other. And we can't play into that narrative. The answer isn't to kind of move to one extreme or the other. It's to, sounds cheesy as anything, doesn't it? But it's to bring people together ultimately.
Yeah, as your potential relative Biden always says,
Yeah.
So, I think you're right. I mean, also just quickly, did he recover? Did he end up becoming, like, after he saw the Holocaust survivor? Did that kid?
Let me tell you, that day, unfortunately I wasn't there. I can't take any credit for it. It wasn't my idea. But I'm told that on the drive home, which was about 2 or 3 hours, he didn't say a word in the car the whole way home. He was profoundly moved and changed by that experience of sitting down and having lunch with a man in his 80s who was able to relate to him what the true lived experience of the Holocaust was like. That was massive for this young boy. And yeah, after that, he was very quickly able to leave the channel process. Never mind shaking my colleague's hand, he gave him a bear hug at the end of it. I think they're still in touch with each other.
Wow.
And to my knowledge, he hasn't been in trouble with authorities since. Yeah, a bit of antisocial behavior perhaps, but nothing on the scale of the, I mean, this was a young lad who, when he first came to police attention, charged at them with a knife, wearing a Friday the 13th style mask that he had decorated with swastikas and white power symbols and 1488 and SS. Like he was an out and out white supremacist at the start of his channel journey. And like I said, by the end of it, reformed. I mean, it's when you hear stuff like that,
it gives you hope, right? And it's one of those things where, these are all excellent, individual case studies, and but one of my obsessions is how to do it at scale. And obviously you can't find every single one, but I think one of the best mechanisms, since you brought up critical thinking, is the education system. Now, I think, obviously the education system, it's difficult when you have to rely on government to do these kinds of things. But I think, obviously, media literacy, critical thinking, there's big issues with that in the US. I mean, when I was in high school, they didn't even, there was no media literacy situation. I don't know what it's like now, but like I think a class kind of dedicated to media literacy throughout, like every year you have it, as soon as you go into middle school, as soon as you're able to like start digesting news. So you teach you how to navigate headlines. That's one aspect. Also just critical thinking generally, the process of breaking things down, questioning things. Because a lot of times conspiracy theorists have the motto of question everything, and extremists and white supremacists. They question everything except the belief system they blindly follow without any questions. So, all right, that makes sense. And critical thinking, and then these really powerful personal stories. Because I think the US does do a good job of teaching the Holocaust, from what I remember in grade school. And it was really moving. Maybe it's just the teachers that I had would really lean on, Eli Wiesel, and they'd lean on personal stories, movies we watch, and you're horrified. You're like, there's no way this was, this was faked. And I think so. I think obviously reforming the education system and all that is a good step on to do what you're saying on that scale. And when it comes to these personal stories, what do you think about the media's involvement? Do you think there needs to be or even storytelling. You know, I know there's stuff, only so much the government can do if the government's the face of this, but it can't, don't you think we kind of need like a societal whole culture approach to this where, you know, we can have movies about this. Like American History X, I thought was a powerful movie in this vein,
Yeah.
and of someone who came out of it. You know, I think storytelling is important. And, you know, do you think, what are your thoughts on how to do kind of what Prevent has done at scale, given just the millions of people that are like I consider QAnon the beginning of the funnel. When people start believing in that, they're slowly, anti-Semitism is couched throughout that entire ideology. Like they're going to eventually start to hate, you know, Black people too, and Latinos and Asians, and like it just slowly pulls you in. So how do you think, what are your thoughts on what America can do at scale to kind of implement a Prevent like situation for these extremists?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think an acknowledgement of the problem is a good first step. And I think we've seen that recently. And I think an assessment of the threat and risk needs to take place, a really comprehensive assessment to appreciate the urgency and the scale of the problems. I do think that there can be lessons learned from other places like the UK, the things that we have done well, alongside the things that we've done not so well, you know, and we need to be humble enough to admit that. And I do think that there is an opportunity for places like the US to learn from our mistakes. And I also think there should be an acknowledgement that resourcing is really important. So I think back to, I think it was 2016 in the US was the last time they had a CVE grants program. And there was about $10 million offered to various NGOs, etc.
And then Trump ended it.
Trump may have ended it, but $10 million is nothing. Do you know what I mean? When you can, at the time, when you consider what the likes of ISIS would have been spending on propaganda alone,
Yeah.
$10 million is a drop in the ocean. So I think there needs to be particular attention paid to the resourcing that is required. But on the flip side of that, I would say from a positive point of view, when you're in that kind of early intervention space, it can provide actually really, really good value for money in cold, hard financial terms. So in the context of the UK, for instance, Prevent costs 40 to 50 million pounds per year, right? Mm-hmm. Now, wider counter-terrorism spending on average is about £2 billion a year. And in 2017, when we had 5 terrorist attacks in the UK, it's thought that that amounted to about £3 billion worth of damage to the UK economy. So forget the human cost in the first instance, which is tragic enough in its own right. When you look at it in cold, hard numerical terms, if Prevent takes up 2% of the counter-terrorism budget for the UK, and yet is still able to support, you know, all of these, it's hundreds of people go through the channel process each year. A couple of years ago, we were working with, I think, 80 different civil society organizations, over 200 Prevent funded projects, about 140,000 participants. That's pretty good value for money. So I think an acknowledgement of the resourcing required, I think, would be beneficial in terms of rolling this out on a wider scale in a US context. And then the other thing that I would say is it's not, and we've touched on this already, I guess, but it's not a law enforcement issue. Mm-hmm. We can't arrest our way out of this problem. Yeah. In the UK, counter-terrorism police would often say things like, we need a whole society approach, or communities can defeat terrorism. Exactly. Which again sounds a wee bit cheesy, but it's actually true. You know, we can. And so I think it's important for any program going forward in the US. Yes, legislation may well play a part. Law enforcement may well play a part. But I think to really get upstream of this and tackle this at its roots, I think it's important to have some kind of program that works with civil society, that works with NGOs, that works with communities, tackling all forms of extremism, open and transparent so that it builds trust of communities in the first instance. I think that's really important. And those are some of the things I think that can be considered going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, especially when you bring up the prevent, the ratio, right, and the fact that 40 million on prevent, or yeah, 40 pound, 40 million pounds, and then the billions spent on terrorism itself, because it's like kind of like why not put more resources on preventing it as opposed to spending so much on the back end of
Yeah.
the result and the outcome of the unchecked extremism. So Biden's actually currently in the process of, creating a national strategy on domestic terrorism, and he's going to release it in the coming weeks, reportedly. So, so that'll be good to see where he sees this fit in, because one of the things I like about the Biden administration is that they really do take it seriously, and I think that they see this as they see the causation of this. They see that it's not just about law enforcement. At least I hope that's what we'll see, because I think you're right. It does take a whole society approach. So it's not just going to be we put all this money in law enforcement and we surveil people and we arrest people and we, that's not how it's going to work. I think one of the best ways to do it, because if we were to just create a prevent program, almost identical to the UK's, it would almost be immediately delegitimized by right-wing media, because they would immediately say, "Oh, don't sign up for this. They're going to indoctrinate you," right? So I think almost one of the more effective ways to do it. Obviously, I think we should have a system like that as well, but couching it in the education system in a way in which we start to think about the fact that people are being radicalized when we create these curriculums, lean more heavily on talking about the racial, like we just don't cheat. Like I grew up in Virginia, like I said, and one of my college professors looked at the two Black people, in me and the other Black person next to me in the class, and said, "You should be proud of what your ancestors did." And said that they were a lot. And first of all, I'm first generation. My parents are from Sierra Leone, so my ancestors weren't slaves. First, number one, so it's racist for him to assume that. But number two, he basically whitewashed slavery and said they weren't treated as badly as they seem, and they're better here than they were there. Essentially, if you have people in the South upholding Confederacy ideals, that's gonna create more extremism. So part of preventing it is just getting rid of that. And also, I think your point with this one kid who, although he went to the Holocaust Museum and he got kind of the white supremacist views out of him, he still had antisocial behavior, right? There's a mental health issue here, where people with these mental health issues will be more likely to gravitate towards extremism, because you're looking for meaning, you're looking for a way to kind of define what's plaguing you. And I think obviously investments in healthcare are a counter-extremism measure. And we don't have the fact that our mental health isn't taken care of here in the US. Seeing a therapist is still semi-taboo. We don't have yearly checkups for our mind, which we should at least. I think you can also put that in education, have a therapist available at schools, and obviously we could go on for forever of dissecting this. And I think there are so many measures that they could put in place. But, I think overall, we've really dived into where I think the Biden administration can make their changes, what prevent does. Before we close out on this awesome interview, I was in great pleasure, speaking to you on this, and just I learned so much. Do you have any final thoughts or anything that you wanted to get out, to message to the viewers in America about maybe what they could do personally to help prevent extremism?
That's a good question. Oh my gosh, now you've put me on the spot. I mean, I think that whole society approach is so important. One of the slightly controversial things about prevent is that it's now enshrined in legislation in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And it's now a legal duty for the education sector and for the health sector, etc., so that teachers and doctors need to be responsive to the risk of extremism and radicalization. But I think ultimately that's been a real benefit, because what it's done is it's really mainstreamed prevent into the world of safeguarding. And when you treat it as a safeguarding issue with like-minded professionals, then you can make so much better progress than criminalizing people, you know? So I think that whole society approach is really important. I think one of the things I would say in respect of the American situation, and I'm by no means, I'm only a casual observer of US politics from home, but I do think that when it comes to, you know, the protections of the Constitution and the difficulties with enacting legislation regarding domestic terrorism, it is worth reflecting, I think, on examples from other countries, for instance. So, for example, in the UK, the terrorism definition relates to action inside or outside the UK.
Yeah.
Because I think, you know, the 7/7 bombings in 2005 were a real wake-up call in the UK to the threat of domestic terrorism. And I think the fact that, I don't want to get too controversial here, but I think the fact that we need to get out of our comfort zones. We need to have uncomfortable conversations. And you could say that in a society that values freedom of speech and everything else, you know, to tackle domestic extremism might make freedom of expression difficult in a free society, you know, that kind of debate.
Yeah.
It's a debate that we need to have, you know. I mean, obviously UK has Human Rights Act as well, freedom of expression. I think freedom of speech is the cornerstone of any democratic society, but I do think we also need to appreciate that with that comes a great responsibility as well.
Precisely.
And that we need to be mindful of when freedom of speech can become hate speech. We need to acknowledge the fact that extremist groups exploit the fact that they've got these wonderful freedoms, and they use that in order to further their own, you know, illegitimate objectives. They use their freedoms to offend others, to demonize minority communities. So I do think it's worth reflecting on whether the hard-fought freedoms that are so important to Western democracies, obviously we need to protect those, but at the same time we need to reflect on whether they give us the right to incite violence or to justify terrorism or to be openly racist or Islamophobic.
Yeah.
Tough conversations that we can't necessarily legislate our way out of. And I don't envy the Biden administration in terms of the difficult journey it's going to have in terms of, you know, enacting all of this and the potential repercussions that it would have in future administrations as well, you know.
Yeah.
But I do think that sometimes we just need to get out of our comfort zone a wee bit, you know.
Yeah.
As hard as that may be. I found it very difficult many a time sitting down and having one-to-one conversations with individuals who hold abhorrent racist views.
Yeah.
But you can't walk away. You can't leave them to their own devices. You know, it's about, as we come back to it time and time again, that empathy and that respect and just, yeah, trying to make a positive difference in people's lives, you know.
Completely understand. You know, on that last point, you know, it's difficult because, you know, I mean, over time, just because I do this work all the time and I try my best to do it, you know, as a person who's, you know, a lot of times a target of their extremism, you know, it's a lot more it's difficult to like break through sometimes. And to, you know, there's been times I've gotten in arguments before. I like tried to keep my zen and keep my cool at all times as a central tenet. But, you know, when you're Black and the person hates you, it's very hard. But I've been able to break through sometimes. And, you know, on your other point on the freedoms, right? It's really an important conversation to have because I think you're right. You know, I don't think it's too controversial because I really think we're having the discussion when it comes to social media companies as is, and you know, you can't yell. Yeah, we prize our First Amendment, but you can't yell fire in a crowded theater when there's no fire, right? There
Sure.
are, you know, just like the Constitution is not absolute. We amend it, you know, we make changes to it, The Second Amendment has been distorted, for example. It was for well-regulated militias, and it was originally also one of the reasons why it was created was to allow people to defend themselves and kind of protect themselves from potential slave rebellion. So that's actually, so, I think people need to kind of recognize that times change, and as times change, amendments need to be made, and different conversations need to be had. We're not going to be restricting free speech, but if you are out here calling for threats of violence, I think social media companies as is are doing the right thing by deplatforming people, by flagging them to law enforcement, by doing various things, because freedom of speech is an excellent freedom. And me, as working in media, of course, how much I prize the First Amendment, but it's one of those things where it's becoming an unsustainable problem to have this speech run so unfettered on social media, especially because I don't think the founding fathers had Twitter in mind when they wrote the Constitution. They didn't, and it's just, we can't have a lot of these, we can't live off dogmas of the past if we're trying to move forward. And obviously these rights are enshrined and we will protect them, but you don't have the right to spread, anti-Semitic bile or anti-Black bile or anti-Asian bile, Latino, and we're seeing this across social media. So important conversations to be had. I think, we'll be grappling with this for a while, and hopefully we find some kind of solution. But one of my biggest fears is when we implement something like this in the US, like, for example, the right-wing media they're already attacking critical race theory as some insane, indoctrination, right? So we're going to have to think about all the risks that come with that, of hopefully safeguarding from disinformation against the program, which I'm sure you've also experienced there. So
yeah, I think just to that, I would say that any legislation, that there are going to have to be checks and balances, aren't there? In the UK, we're fortunate we have an independent reviewer of terrorism legislation who can hold the government to account. And the threshold for things like prescribing terrorist organizations is really, really high.
Yeah.
So I think there's a role for it, but yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It needs to be managed very carefully and responsibly going forward.
For sure. All right, Sean. Well, I think this was an amazing conversation. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate your time. I think our viewers learned a lot. And, I'm going to see you on the panel. We're going to do the final panel with all of these brilliant experts get together in, I think, late May, early June. So I'll see you then, my brother. Thanks for being here.
Looking forward to it. Great to meet you finally.
All right, my friend. Take care.
Bye-bye.